Can you describe how you and yours personally ended up in Utah and how this relates to your experience with food? And let's start with Edie and then maybe go around.
Okay. My father was born in Fukushima, Japan. My mother was born in Oakland, California. They were married on the morning of December 7th, 1941. And they were sent, wow. Pearl Harbor Day. And they were sent to the concentration camp near Delta, Utah, which at the time was referred to as Topaz Relocation Center. So we came to Utah via that. Growing up, they never talked about the camp experience, but they taught my siblings and myself to be very proud to be Japanese American. And Mother was, without a doubt, one of the finest Japanese cooks in our community. When we go to potlucks, her dishes were the first to be, eaten. And although the traditional, and Jean, you can verify this, the traditional Japanese food is very expensive. You shrimp tempura, making all of the sushi, sashimi, and it's messy. But if you want to bring people together, you make your traditional food. So for the important occasions like a birth, a death, a graduation, out-of-town visitors, or any time you want to bring people together, Mother would just make this incredible Japanese spread of traditional food. And even our everyday meals always included gohan. I mean, breakfast with eggs and bacon, we had gohan. I didn't need hash browns, but so food was very important. If you want to bring people together, you did it with your traditional food.
Thank you so much, Edie. What about for you, Jean? And I'll go ahead and repeat the question just in case you got lost in Edie's eloquence. Can you describe how you and yours personally ended up in Utah and how this relates to your experience with food?
I came to Utah in the early 90s, and I came because I had gone through 3 kind of life-altering experiences, including losing a child. And I was offered a position in Utah that was a business and that taught, the head of it taught right brain kind of activities to left brain businesses like banks and attorneys and accountants and that type of thing. And after I moved here, he wanted to move the company to San Diego. But by that time, my kids and I liked especially the landscape of Utah, and I connected with the Japanese community rather quickly, and we decided to make this home. And wherever I've been in America, Japanese food has always remained kind of a touchstone and an underpinning for our family, and something that always takes me back to Japan. And so I have these weird, quirky kinds of things, like I don't like eating out of styrofoam, and I don't like white rice in a white bowl, and I have all these little weird thingies that are so attached to Japanese food and the way that it's prepared and in particular presented. And being in the arts, that's really important. I hate ugly food. So there, I said it.
I love the strong statements coming in right out the gate. Brock, how did you and yours end up in Utah, and how does that relate to your experience with the food here?
I'm one of those old traditional Scandinavian immigrant types. My great grandparents came from Switzerland and England and Denmark, and married in traditional Mormon fashion, and down through the ages, here comes me. And so that felt like the right thing for me to start researching that kind of traditional pioneer food. And then shortly after my first book came out, I really took a deep dive into Japanese food and culture. I went on a Mormon mission to Japan way back in the day. But I always tell people that I was more of a convert to Buddhism than any of them were converted to my Mormonism. So I've kind of been studying Japanese food a lot lately, and just trying to figure out how it all works. And I really like Jean said, I really love the aesthetics of it, and the beauty of it is really wonderful. So this evening before coming down, I had a homey bowl of kare don, rice bowl with curry. So there you go.
I love how
Always
much
get
I'm
that
learning about
Gohan
you,
in.
Papa Jade. What was that, Jean?
Always get that Gohan in. I think the Japanese, I don't know about other cultures, but we have asa Gohan for breakfast, and Hita Gohan for lunch, and Ban Gohan for dinner. And I don't know how many cultures have a different word for certain foods, whether that's differentiated by when you eat it, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So
That's fascinating. And I feel like that leads into the next question I had really well, which is about like the symbolism of food. So Jean at one point writes that rice symbolizes health and the culture. Edie writes that apples bring peace and health. So I'm curious, yes, for everybody in the room, what's your favorite food symbolism? And what's the story behind that association? Especially going through some of Edie's, I'm like, there was a whole like litany of them. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, how did all these foods end up with these associations? And I'm also particularly interested about the Gohan now, just because it's like, oh, that's a food that I bet a lot of Utahns are unfamiliar with. And I'm curious the weight that it carries symbolically for y'all.
well, in the Japanese culture, food, rice is way more than a grain or a food. It symbolizes so much more, prosperity, longevity, health. When you mentioned, or when I mentioned in the film about the Japanese men not being emaciated, the word was, "Have you been fed?" And they said no, because they hadn't been given rice. But it also, the cultivation, especially the wet cultivation of rice, I think has given Japan that long trajectory into how they function as a society, because the farmers were near each other. They had to collectively work together to make sure the water was irrigated properly, harvest time, all kinds of things. And it kind of, I think, has led to that whole sense of community, of consensus, building community, living in harmony, especially in a country that's enormous population for such a small place of land. And it's just, and there are products made out of rice. I mean, I grew up on tatami floors. They use the entire rice plant. They make the scrub stuff to wash your face. They have powder, face powder, just all kinds of things.
Thank you so much, Jean. Anything to add, Brock and Edie?
About food symbolism?
Mhm.
Yeah, for me, I think just the symbol of people coming together, that's what food symbolizes to me, more than anything, is just not nutrients or fuel or any of that, but just that food symbolizes to me people coming together, sharing culture, sharing the moments of love in their lives. Like I have a friend who's in the Society of Friends, and they say that anytime people get together to share food, that is the sacrament of Christ. Whether you're eating a sandwich or the Eucharist, it's just people sharing food together is a holy thing. And that's kind of a perspective that I use to base my experiences around.
Yeah, and bringing in that religious aspect of course, like it adds a whole nother dimension. Is there any other foods from like Utah culture that have a specific symbolism that you've noticed that kind of stands out? One of the ones in the book, which caught me by surprise, even though I've lived in Utah and known that Jell-O was a thing, I did not know it was precisely green Jell-O. Like I was like, oh, I didn't know that the color was that precise when it came to it. And I just have so many questions when it comes to like, why the green Jell-O? Other than Jell-O, yes, generally being delicious. But for Edie and Brock, if there's any particular food that you think the symbolism is particularly rich on, feel free to add something. And if not, we can go over to the next question.
Well, you know, it's not,
for the most, excuse me, Brock, the most of the Asian cultures, their traditional foods for New Year is very important. The Japanese always had an entire fish. You had to have the tail and the head on it. And that when you go to a Chinese New Year, they always serve that whole fish. And my Japanese New Year, my mother's best friend would always make a Mount Fuji out of on. And it was made out of on, and it was sweet and wonderful, and I'd always try to eat it. And my mother would just kind of crack me on the side of the head and say, you know, you don't eat Mount Fuji, just leave it. But, you know, they had all these symbolism, things that I just kind of learned, not directly, but just by listening to the elders talk about, oh, did you make this? Did you make the gobo? Did you make the ohagi and all that? And Jean, being raised in Japan, probably had a more direct education on tradition.
Edie, did you eat on New Year's? Did you eat ozoni with
Oh,
the
of
mochi,
course.
the cake of mochi? I think that is
Yes.
something
That's good.
everybody has to have. And
Well, I had to, because I don't
which
like
is
mochi.
pounded rice cake is also put on the altars, you know,
Right.
honoring ancestors.
and
So
also soba noodles at New Year.
yeah.
We should have warned people to eat like a full meal before attending, because I'm just here like salivating. All these things sound delicious. This next question's particularly for
Go
Edie.
back to symbols of food for
Go back
just a
to it.
minute.
Yeah, go
Here
for
in,
it.
yeah, here in Utah, a lot of our older communities have agricultural roots, and they all seem to have some sort of an agricultural specialty focus. And here in Brigham City, of course, we just came through Peach Day.
Peaches.
And so for the past month, I have eaten more peaches in a month than most folks do in a year. But it's those peaches that hold the symbolism of our own local hometown bounty. And so if you were to go to any of the different agricultural communities throughout Utah, you'd find little things that is their special thing that other places just don't understand.
And I love that you mentioned peaches. I had a peach tree in my backyard growing up. And of course, my family, not knowing the precise way how to care for it, were like stunned when it loaded itself with so much food that it like started to split. And we're like, oh no, like this tree will like produce fruit until its demise, and we had to like quickly go in to support the tree. But I love that little kind of small town vibes that you get with like particular foods. I'm thinking of like raspberry shakes, which are particular special in certain parts of Utah, and different things like that. The question I had for Edie is, there's a story that you allude to about Tajiro Kasuga becoming a millionaire through like a strawberry or something like that, or like a breed of strawberry. So I'm wondering, yes, if you can tell us more about that story, yes, because I would have never thought that a fruit could like, that sort of ingenuity could make somebody a millionaire. So I'm curious.
Well, Tajiro came to Utah in 1895. And he became a farmer. And in Japan, farming was revered because they fed the whole country. And so that was a very honorable occupation, as it should be revered in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But he chose to grow strawberries, which is a valuable Utah crop, but was really disappointed at the quality of the plants that were available. So he wrote to the agriculture department and asked, how do I crossbreed plants? And he received a manual, And for the next 10 years, he worked on developing a new strain of strawberry, which he named the ever-bearing 20th century strawberry. And the patent on this new strain made him a millionaire. But that didn't protect him from the racism from his neighbors. His farm was at the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon. The neighbors resented the fact that he had access to the water line that brought water to the city of Salt Lake. And because he was Japanese and this was the 1940s, they were afraid that he was going to poison the water. So they harassed him enough that he was forced to move, and he relocated in Sandy, Utah. And although his 20th century strawberry really isn't grown that much now, the descendant, which is called the Ozark Beauty, is currently grown. And Mr. Kazuga died at the age of 84 in Sandy in 1964. But yeah, he became a millionaire.
Oh my gosh. And that's there was so much you just packed into like a minute of this like person's life. So thank you so much for that like knowledge. And like I'm curious like where we would even find that story in history if we were looking for it. I'm gonna add a little follow-up. Like stories like these, they seem to be like held by the community. And I'm wondering if like for some other stories like these, whether Jean, Edie, or Brock, you know where to find these other than in this cool book, right? That this is the place.
Some of those are in the heads of the elders in our communities, as always, the wise people.
Mm.
A lot of my museum career was spent at agricultural museums. Up at This Is the Place, or at we had a farming museum in Littleton, Colorado, or even at Fort Buenaventura, we did some agricultural history. And these agricultural museums, there's actually a professional organization just for agricultural historians. And there are archives at these museums that hold all sorts of documents that help explain and explore these sorts of histories. So it's definitely a niche, and visitation at these little museums is far behind what it ought to be. But there are dedicated professionals who are working to keep it still vibrant in our minds.
Thank you so much for alluding to those. Like, I feel like there's so many different little types of museums. And when you think about museums, usually it's like an art museum or a science museum. And it's good to know that there's even these like little agricultural ones that we should be looking out for, because they'll have little nuggets like this.
Even
Willie,
Wheeler Farm.
Willie,
Mhm.
the little library in Manti has a corner, and I got stuck in Manti in a rainstorm, and I buried myself in that corner. And it's all this material about the history of how they built the temple. And one of the fun things that came out was the term temple eggs. And that was where the community was asked to, they could eat the eggs the rest of the week. But on the weekend, on Fridays and Saturdays, I believe, and Sundays, you weren't supposed to use the eggs in your own family. You were supposed to take them to the ward house or wherever, and save those for the temple workers that were working on the temple. Those were the temple eggs for them.
Fascinating.
So I think there are little nooks and crannies like that in all kinds of local libraries that may not, an area that may not have a museum, but those stories are there.
Yeah, you gotta be sniffing around for them. Go, bro.
Another fun story from Manti. When I was writing the book, I came across this story where the pioneers in Manti were starving. They hadn't proved their farms up yet, and they didn't have anything stored for after they'd come down. They were starving, I tell you. And so in this history, they were inspired to try eating pigweed, which is kind of a native weed, and it's not too terribly tasty, but they were inspired to try eating it, and they did. They cut this pigweed at the temple hill. It was apparently covered in pigweed. And so they cut all the pigweed, and they were fed for that day. And then they didn't know what they were going to do the next day. And so they prayed really hard, and God answered their prayers, and there was more pigweed.
Oh my gosh. Do you have any idea what that tasted like?
They ate the roots, the pigweed plant,
Mm.
kind of a fibrous, starchy root. It's not quite as good as a potato, but it's edible.
Mm, good to know. And I feel like that leads me to this question that I had specifically for you, Brock, which is like you have this line at some point in your essay where it's like, yeah, Mormons at some point ate crows, ate wolves, and early Mormon food culture. And can you elaborate on some of these stories in particular? And I wanted to also contrast that with these narratives we kind of get, like the one you just mentioned, which are like these narratives of like pioneers being close to starvation and having to go like and eat like some food that like they're like pigweed that, you know, they're not accustomed to and probably isn't what they would choose to eat if they had the decision, and how those sort of narratives tend to dominate the imagination of like what early Mormon food culture are. But like you said in your essay, is that that's actually just like a very small time period in a lot of the Mormon history where like Mormons were required to like extend themselves into those dire circumstances. So I'm curious about the crows and the wolves, just because I had no idea about that. And I'm curious just about your thoughts about why that dominates.
Yeah, you know, and if you think about everything we've talked about so far in this chat, a lot of our discussion has been focused around like special times, like New Year's or harvest seasons, or not the usual normal day-to-day sort of a thing. And so, of course, if we were to talk about the normal day-to-day sort of mac and cheese things that we eat, nobody'd be interested in that. And so instead, we talk about the remarkable and the unusual and the special celebrations. And those are the things those are the times when we pull out all the stops, when we eat the really good stuff. Or in Mormon pioneer legends, it's more about the tales that verify you were one of the early, had to prove this valley to be, you know, bountiful before other folks came along, and that comes with a sort of seniority. And that in Mormon lore, those experiences started in Salt Lake City in 1847, and then as they settled out, they'd move out down the riparian waterways and down through any fertile grasslands and keep expanding the footprint. And as they expand the footprint, they're always, even though Salt Lake was settled in 1847, those outlying communities weren't settled until the 1870s or 80s, or going down into Arizona and Mexico into the turn of the century before those outlying farms were ever settled. And so those first stories about the privations and the hardships, even though Salt Lake was settled 30 years earlier, kept telling that story for decades and decades in the new settlements. And probably, I'm guessing, the same stories are kind of told by Japanese folks in immigration, that as immigrants came to Utah and they had to figure out how to live in Utah as Japanese immigrants, that there were hard times before they established their businesses and invented the strawberries. Those early times were probably hard for them too. And they probably tell those same sorts of privation stories.
Thank you for that insight. That was such a surprising, I was like, wow, I feel so fulfilled in that answer. So I just want to give a thumbs up to that really quick. The next question I wanted to move for was talking to everybody just about what your thoughts were about the collection kind of as a whole, and how it weaves kind of a picture of Utah, and what you've been able to see of it so far. Yes, because it had a very ambitious like goal, you know, try to fit all the food kind of ways and cultures of Utah and try to represent it in a couple hundred pages. So I was curious, just looking at it from a bird's eye view, what were things that y'all were noticing? And I had little 2 cents, but I'm curious, yes, about what y'all were seeing in there.
You know, one thing that I wish they had more of was the Native American dishes, because the Urban Indian Center had a evening of traditional Native American foods, and they had fried grasshoppers, pinon cakes, bison and turnip, mutton and corn stew, and blue mush. And the neatest thing was they had these chips, and they looked kind of like potato chips, but they were made out of the blue corn. And I was just fascinated by it. So I asked my friend, how did you make that? How is this made? And she said, well, traditionally, we put a very smooth stone on the open fire, and we would make the mush really, really like watery. We take a handful of this watery mush and we spread it on the smooth stone, and it was so hot, it would just kind of like air fry it, right? And then we just take it off and put it in the basket.
Oh, man.
And I said, oh my goodness, did you do that? And she looked at me, she says, no, Edie, I used a crepe maker for these. But I thought, that is so cool that they could use a traditional recipe, but a modern appliance. And when Jean was talking about we're losing things like that because the elders are dying. And, at the Urban Indian Center, we call the seniors the wisdom keepers. And that's what they are. And I kind of wished that, like the kneel down bread, it would be fun to have had a little more Native American recipes. I know it's very difficult because all the different tribes in Utah have different traditions, but they had the healing tea, and the blue mush, and I don't know. That was
There's
one
a
thing
lot
I
to
was kind of
explore
looking
there.
for.
Yeah, no, for some programming we did last month as a part of Kimball Arts Center and Jorge Rojas's residency, we had featured this book on Navajo corn recipes. And just in this like very thin book, there was like dozens of different ways that like the corn was used with like traditional and then contemporary kind of ways of cooking it. And yeah, that by itself is like, oh yeah, there's a lot to explore here that's already overwhelming. So I completely feel that. Brock, Jean, did you have anything to add as far as like your thoughts about like trying to comprehensively look over and review the collection? What were you noticing as things that were going great, things that you were like,
Well, one of the things I appreciated about it that Edie mentioned earlier, it really does demonstrate the diversity of Utah, because I think Utah is often the misperception is that it is not diverse, and that is obviously not the case. I kind of wished I had seen more recipes from the Latino cultures, because those are so, man, the range of those are so enormous. It's kind of like the Asian groups. They're just endless variations of that kind of food. And I think just in the Salt Lake area, it's amazing to me the variety of different ethnic restaurants, whether it's Peruvian, El Salvadorian, or whatever, that I would have liked to have seen some more exploration of that. But at the same time, I thought they did a super job starting to dig the surface. And perhaps there's a volume 2 out there someplace.
yeah.
That would include writers and cooks and people that some of us may not know yet,
And I shared those thoughts with you about the Latino community just because of how large the numbers were, where they did have a few references here. The Cafe Rio versus like Costa Beetle, and I was like, oh, we could have reached out to some food trucks like that are layered across Salt Lake for maybe a different kind of take on like those same cultures too. And Brock, you were about to say something?
Well, yeah, it's interesting, the things that show up in an anthology. Generally, I guess you could say the things that show up are the people who choose to write. And so I guess whoever the editors went out and kind of solicited what they knew was out there, but maybe we don't know where the scholars of this or that type of or food heritage are. But it's amazing what did show up in there. But I guess what you are saying is that what did show up represents a lot of really slim niche markets in our food profile, but doesn't necessarily represent the demographics by the numbers.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of that, but I shared Gene, and I'm sure the rest of you may have expressed this. I might have gotten it wrong who precisely said this. But as far as breaking ground, it's like, oh, whoa, this is doing a whole bunch of work and something that's incredibly unexplored. So that was something I definitely wanted to point to. And Jody Graham asked in the Q&A, yes, love to know if there's anything that came from by surprise. And that's what Brock pointed to, is like the incredible like diversity and the thought that was given to that in the book. Kind of shifting over to that, was there anything that surprised you, Gene or Edie?
Not really, because I've explored food for so long, and I haven't always focused on Japanese food. That's something my family and my kids always like to explore, and they would like to explore world food, and having things like living traditions, you know, that Salt Lake Arts Council sponsors, and you can eat your way around the world with their food booths and all the ethnic festivals that take place. The one this past summer about the Koreans, the Korean festival, there's Polynesian festival. There are so many festivals that you really can eat your way around the world. And when we have places like the Spice Kitchen, then you can eat stuff like Sudanese food and, you know, such a huge variety. So I just like the exploration of all kinds of food.
Well, who doesn't, huh?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go over and switch over to another kind of set of questions. And this one is particularly for Edie and Gene. And I was noticing while reading the book that there seemed to be like this trend of some of the ethnic communities in Utah being displaced for like either progress, or like one of them was displaced for the Salt Palace Convention Center. And what I wanted to kind of point to was, why are these ethnic communities important? And can we talk more about some of the material effects that these acts of like gentrification, or whatever you want to call it, for whatever reason these communities are displaced, kind of the effects it ends up having on these communities. I feel like a lot of our conversation about food, especially when it's come to some of the ethnic foodways, have come from communities that have gathered in a central location. And like being a Utahn who, you know, was familiar with Utah in the 2000s and like now, because that's when I grew up, like the idea of there being like a whole Japanese town in Utah, or a whole like Chinatown in Utah, just like blew my mind. Like, we used to have that, like that was huge. So I guess I wanted to gather some of your thoughts on that, is because it seemed like a place where some of the like, yes, geographics of the city like intersects with and impacts the foodways so much.
Well, I grew up in Salt Lake, and so I was very familiar with Japantown. It was kind of, you could call it anchored, but the Japanese Christian church was there. And on the other corner, well, actually right across the street, was the Japanese Buddhist temple. And then you go farther down, there was the cleaner, there was a mihoya, which is the Japanese confection, and Sunrise Fish Market, where you could buy all manner of fish for sushi or whatever. There was Sage Farm Market, and there was the pagoda, and all kinds of businesses there. And when they had to move because of the Salt Palace, there were 3 businesses that were successful for a while. There was the Aloha Cafe, and I think the mihoya tried it, and then Sage Farm. And today, the only one that still survived is Sage Farm. They call it Japan Market on Main Street. But to me, it was a very safe and wonderful place where I could go buy Japanese gifts for my friends for birthdays and Christmas. It was a place where I felt so comfortable the first time I went to Hawaii, because everybody looked like me. Well, on Sunday, which is the most racially divided day of the week, the Japanese, Buddhists, and the Christians you know, it was just a very comfortable place where people knew each other. We knew the families, we knew what was going on. We planned fishing trips and picnics and things and find out what is needed and who is ill. And it was just a very nice community. And now I wish my grandchildren had that experience. We still can go to Obon, and when COVID's gone, we can go back to Nihon Matsuri or Aki Matsuri. But all over the United States, the Japantowns are disappearing, and it's because the real estate can be used more profitably for condos and business buildings and things like that. But yeah, Utah had the Plum Alley, and now they have the Chinatown on 3900 South State, and that includes Korean. If anybody's into K-drama, it includes the Korean chicken and another little ready-to-eat Korean place. But I think the ethnic centers are very valuable to the community.
But it's not just the economics that are displacing it, I think. Like up here in Box Elder, we used to have a Buddhist church in Honeyville. And
You still do.
Well, sure, but they
Because
seem
Reverend
to,
Hirano goes there.
right, but they seem to be holding services there less regularly because it's hard to get the priest to come up from Ogden, and the priest that services Ogden comes up from Salt Lake sometimes.
Yeah, it's Reverend Hirano.
Yeah, but
He does both.
it seems that the Japanese communities that used to be more prominent up in this end of the woods are kind of scattering somewhat. And when they do get together, it's hard to get it together.
Right, but Box Elder and Ogden had 25th Street, but they didn't have an established Japantown like Salt Lake City. And that's what's missing, I think.
Anything more to add, Jean, or no?
Well, you know, I didn't grow up here, and but when I first came to the States, I remember how excited I was to be in LA's Japantown.
Yeah.
And then when I discovered San Francisco's Japantown with that cool hardware store there, I was really a happy camper. But I admit, I now listen to the stories of the elders talking with such nostalgia and sometimes tears about what they don't have anymore, and as primarily not just a place to shop and stuff, but really to gather and to be with each other and to be with those that look like you, and the smells were the same and the sounds were the same. I remember the first time when I first came to Salt Lake, I was just stunned in the 90s because I moved here from the Houston area and had grown up in Japan. And I remember the first one of the Asian festivals that they held at the Salt Palace. I walked into that and immediately burst into tears because it was like, wow, I'm coming home. The world looks like it's supposed to look like, it smells like it's supposed to smell like, it sounds like it's supposed to smell, sound like, and maybe I'll get to taste something of home. But I think that cohesion is so important, and that's why this pandemic has been so hard, especially for some of our older Japanese in the community, because it's just that gathering, that sense of kinship, that this is my tribe. But I have to say, I'm just ecstatic at the plans that are moving ahead to preserve just that one block of what used to be Japantown that's anchored by the Buddhist temple and the little Presbyterian congregation, the Japanese Church of Christ. That is well under planning. There's designs for it. And I'm just really excited about that because of the city's commitment to preserving just that little chunk, of Japantown. And that will still be the site for the Obon Festival, where we honor the ancestors that have left this planet, and for the Matsuris that Edie was referring to. the festival kind of settings. And we're hoping it will again be a gathering place
Mhm.
for
No,
Utah Japanese.
I think we're all hoping that we can have a semblance of what used to be there and even more, especially as our community diversifies and grows. As a kind of just last way, as we're rounding up the hour to end, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to kind of share your favorite Japanese food spot in Utah. It's okay if it's your own kitchen, and maybe your favorite Asian market. Just because, of course, if you were interested in, following some of the recipes, particularly like the Asian ones or some of the other ethnic ones, like you can't just always go to like your Smith's marketplace and expect to be able to find those ingredients. So if you had a favorite food spot that you wanted to show a little love to, now would be the time. As well as like, hey, if you're trying to make this stuff, this is the store you need to go to. Like otherwise it's like you can't replace, some of those ingredients. You can't.
Well, my favorite Japanese food spot these days is Hanamaru in Ogden. It's on about 37th and just west of Washington, behind the Macy's. And it's as good a Japanese as I've ever had anywhere, run by a first generation Japanese man and his wife. Yeah, I highly recommend Hanamaru.
Mm.
I want to hear what Jean says.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much at stake for both Jean and Edie's answer here that they're like, oh, I might get
I
somebody
want to try
mad.
Brock. Brock talked about this place when the three of us were together doing the cooking stuff. My favorite, hands down, it depends on what it is. My favorite, hands down, for sushi is Takashi's here in downtown. I like to go to Koyo's for fried oysters and agadashi tofu. And there's some things at Kyoto that I like, but I have to admit, I like my own kitchen, and I go to Sage Market every week. I mean, that's just part of, I'll figure out some way to squeeze Sage Market in. And if nothing else, to run in there for a noon snack of inari sushi or futomaki, or pick up a curry raisu, like Brock likes, or grab in the wintertime. It's a great place to pick up a great bowl of ramen. They have different kinds of ramen. So, and I like all the snacks, the senbi and the different seaweed. In fact, I keep seaweed here at my office because sometimes when I'm super hungry, I just need something savory.
To that
much
point,
on seaweed that somebody thought the other day was chocolate, and I thought, no.
to that point, Jean, it is a crying shame that I never got to see the Japantown in Salt Lake back in its heyday. But
Yeah.
we do have Ocean Mart these days.
Yeah.
Has a great selection. Our Ocean Mart in Roy, they're opening a new location in Ogden on 12th Street and Washington, probably by Christmas. And so that'll be nice, a lot closer for me. And then I can make my own food at home.
Well,
and I like that I forgot, in terms of groceries, I do like the Ocean City Seafood Market here in downtown, because they bring in fresh clams every Saturday, and they do an extraordinary job hosing those down. And if you plan your trip there at the right time, that's a great place to buy seafood. Oxtails for pho too. What about you, Edie? I know you like the Korean chicken down in Utah County or American Fork or whatever.
Of course. But, for Japanese, and I haven't eaten anything else there. So I'm like you. I like Kyoto for some and Koyo for some and Takashi's. But I tried Ito's sushi out here on Fort Union, and they have sushi without rice. And I loved it. They had 3 rolls.
Was it sashimi or what? Was
it
rolled?
They rolled it in sashimi, and they had it with, the nori around the crab, but they didn't have any rice. And it's kind of like having local mocha with brown rice. I mean, I loved it. We shop Sage Farm all the time. We shop Chinatown Market because they have everything. And like the Ocean City, that's great too. But I think the Chinatown Market has a little bit of everything.
Including durian and stuff like that.
Yeah, like
Really, really interesting looking stuff back in the meat market, the butcher area. Yeah.
right. And they've got great, whatever you call it, for the banh mi, for your Vietnamese sandwiches.
And they have a super collection of moon cakes during the New Year's, the Chinese New Year's. A huge array of moon cakes. Some of them really expensive.